I would be delighted if you could contribute to any charity or cause of your choice, any small amount you wish. Okay, and you could keep it to yourself. And if you intimate me, I think I shall be delighted anyway. So with this preamble, let me start today's talk. In my last talk, I spoke about the four truths of Buddha and his eightfold path, and the theory of anatma, that is there's no atma. No, and I also spoke about the great philosopher Nagarjuna and his Sunyavada. As I said last week, in the first 500 years of the Common Era, Buddhism branched off into so many streams, some big and some small, that it is quite difficult to tell one from the other, even for the experts. What adds to the confusion is that some of the philosophers took one stand in their earlier years and changed them quite dramatically to another in the later years. One such philosopher was Vasubandhu. According to legend, he was converted to Mahayana Buddhism by his own half-brother, his older half-brother, I think. But prior to that, he was a firebrand within the so-called Abhidharma branch of Buddhism, attacking rival Abhidharmikas for their views about past and future reality. So once he came into the Mahayana fold, he joined Asanga as a co-founder of a one branch within Mahayana Buddhism known as Yogacara. This school is often seen as offering a kind of idealist vision of Buddhism, rejecting even the minimal concessions to extra-mental reality made by other Buddhists like the Abhidharmikas. Now, what is Abhidharmika? Like in my last speech, I spoke about the two satyas, that is Satya, that is Samvritti Satya and Paramarthika Satya. We also spoke about the constituents called dharmas and how they heap and they become skandhas by heaps. That I don't want to go into that now. Abhidharmika school says that the conventionally existent, that is the Samvritti Satya, comprises all temporarily enduring macro objects, whatever perishes, they all belong to the conventionally existent Samvritti Satya. The ultimate Satya, according to them, is the set of interrelated elements that make up the empirical world, that is dharmas. That is all sensory phenomena of whatever nature as we experience them through the six sense faculties, that is five physical sense plus mind, manas. As we have seen, Nagarjuna is opposed to this very understanding of two truths. He was very clear. According to the Madhyamaka Marka, that is his system, the foundational idea is that the Paramarthika Satya is an empty set. A point that they characteristically promote by insisting on the Sunyavada, the emptiness or the relativity of not only of the whole such as persons, but also of the dharmas, that is the analytical categories. Okay, these are the categories. Now, Vasubandhu, the Yogacara school, his school, while agreeing to the Madhyamikas, as to the unreality of the external subjects, external objects, differs from them in holding that the mind cannot be regarded as unreal. This is a very fundamental difference. Please listen to me carefully. They say that the mind cannot be regarded as unreal. For them, all reasoning and thinking would be false, and the Madhyamikas could not even establish that their own arguments were correct. That is, if mind is also unreal, their argument also is produced by the mind, that argument will also be unreal. To say that everything mental or non-mental is unreal, the Yogacara, the Vasubandhu school thought would be suicidal. The reality of the mind should at least be admitted in order to make correct thinking possible. Is it clear? This is what Vasubandhu says. This is the difference between the Madhyamika school. The mind, consisting of a stream of different kinds of ideas, is the only reality. This is what they hold. Things that appear to be outside the mind, our body as well as other objects, are merely ideas of the mind. Just as in case of dreams and hallucinations, a man fancies to perceive things outside, though they really do not exist. Similarly, the objects which we appear to be out there are really ideas of mind. What he says in essence is, your dream is a subset of a big dream. Okay, when you wake up, you are in a bigger dream. That's what it says. There is another. You are sleeping. This is only a subset of your sleeping. That's what Vasubandhu says. The existence of any external object cannot be proved because it cannot be shown that the object is different from the consciousness of the object. That is, if you see something, if you see a book, let us say a book, okay, unless you are conscious that this is a book, you won't be able to perceive it, So he says the book is there only in your mind, it's not real. Okay. The blue color, the example given is, the blue color and the consciousness of the blue color are identical because they are never perceived to exist separately. Okay. Though really one, they may appear two owing to illusion, as the moon, Shankara, the famous example, the moon appears as two owing to defective vision. If your vision is defective, things will appear as two. Okay. So it is a defective vision. That's what the philosophy says. As an object is never known without the consciousness of it, the object cannot be proved to have an existence independent of consciousness. This is what the Yogacara philosophy says. Okay. It also points out some of the absurdities, according to them, some of the absurdities which would arise from would arise if you admit that there are objects external to the mind. The external object, if admitted, must be either atomic or composed of many parts. Okay. If it is atomic, okay, the atoms, of course, cannot be perceived. a, a composite thing, like a part or a book, also cannot be perceived because it is not possible to perceive simultaneously all the sides and parts of the object. When you hold a book, you see only the cover. You don't know what is inside the book. You don't know what is written there. Okay, so you don't perceive the entire book when you see a book. You see only a bit of it. When you open a page, you see that page are the 2 pages. You don't see the entire thing. Same way, if you take a part, you don't see what is in the other side of the part or the bottom of the part. You don't see that. Okay. So what he says is, you can't perceive anything in its completeness. This is what this philosophy says. Okay. See, if you can't say that it is, you can perceive it part by part, like you read a book, because that part also, if it's atomic, that can also be subdivided. If it's atomic, they are too small to be perceived. And if you say that they are composite, then the original argument will come, Again, what is it composite of? Okay. That, of course, that argument will arise. So, what they say is, if you take a position that object is nothing other than consciousness, then the question of parts and the whole does not arise with regard to the consciousness. What you see is what you conscious of is what is real. That's what it says. Okay. There are other, philosophically they are giving, lots of lots of objections. Another difficulty is that the consciousness of the object cannot arise before the object come into existence. Okay. You cannot, let us say, a new book is written by Arundhati Roy, let us say. Before the book arrives, you can't conceive of the book. It is not in your consciousness. Okay. Neither can it arise afterwards, because the object being momentary vanishes as soon as it arises. This is what the Yogacara philosophy says. Okay. So if you think of something else, then the book disappears. Okay. The book is not in your mind. Okay. The external object, according to those who admit it, being the cause of consciousness, cannot be simultaneous with consciousness. Okay. They say they are not one. The external, this is another difficulty. If you think they are real, they can't be simultaneous with consciousness. Nor can it be said the object may be known by consciousness after it has ceased to exist. Okay. For in that case, the object being in the past, there cannot be any immediate knowledge or perception of it. Okay. So they say, perception of present objects, as we must admit always to have, remains therefore unexplained if objects are supposed to be external to the mind. Okay. This difficulty will not arise if objects are supposed to be nothing other than consciousness. They give a load of difficult and different arguments. Some of them are that it's beyond me to hold that external objects are unreal. They exist only in your mind. The philosophy is also called Vijnanavada or idealism, because it admits that there is only one kind of reality, which is the nature of consciousness, Vijnana. And objects which appear to be material or external to consciousness are really ideas or states of consciousness. This theory is described by some scholars as subjective idealism, because according to it, the existence of an object perceived is not different from the subject or the perceiving mind. Okay, this is what they say. Now, what is the chief difficulties of this? One of the, in fact, there are many difficulties. I will highlight one. What is the chief difficulty of this subjective idealism? If an object depends on for its existence solely on the subject, then how is it that the mind cannot create at will any object at any time? Okay, this is a very important question. You don't think of, you will not be able to think of things which are not in existence, That's not possible for your mind. How is it explained that objects do not change, appear or disappear at the will of the perceiver? If I read a book by Arundhati Roy, let us say The God of Small Things, just because I will it, it doesn't become a James Hadley Chase novel. It remains The God of Small Things. Okay. To explain this difficulty, the Vijnanavadin says that the mind is a momentary mind is a stream of momentary conscious state, and within the stream there lie buried impressions, that is samskara of all past experience. Okay, so you can't perceive something without past experience. That's what it says. Okay, at a particular moment, that latent expression comes to the surface of the consciousness, for which the circumstances of the moment are the most favorable. Okay, when you see Arundhati Roy's book, you see the title, you see the name, you see everything. You must have read it about somewhere else. So all these things are favorable. Then you presume that it is Arundhati Roy's book. This is what the Vijnanavada says. That is, it says the impression at that moment, that impression attains paribhaga. That is maturity. It has and develops into immediate consciousness or perception. Okay, it is thus that at that particular moment only that object whose latent impression can under circumstances reveal itself becomes perceived. Okay, this is what the Vijnanavadas says. Okay, it's quite complicated. Okay, but still, see, the Vijnanavadas, they say the mind considered in its object of being a storehouse. Okay, it is they say the mind is sort of a storehouse, and for that they have a name. It's called Alya Vijnana. It may be a storehouse of the residence of impressions, all impressions. That's the mind. Okay. In fact, it can be compared to some extent, it can be compared to the soul or the Atman of the other systems, with the difference that it is not the unchanging subject like a soul, but is a stream of continuously changing states. We should not forget that. Okay. What it says is, through culture and through self-control, the Alya Vijnana or the potential mind can gradually stop the arising of undesirable mental state and develop into the ideal state of nirvana. You require that practice. Okay. Otherwise, it only gives rise to thoughts. The philosophy says thoughts, desire, attachment, which bind us more and more to the so-called fictitious external world. Don't believe in this world. It is unreal. Okay. They say the mind, the only reality according to this school, is truly its own place. It is the mind which can make heaven of hell or hell of heaven. Okay. the Yogacharas are so called because they used to practice yoga by which they thought they could realize the sole reality of mind, dispelling all belief in the external world. Okay, so that's the reason why they were called, Yogachara, the Vijnanavadis were called that. So now I come to the end of what Vasubandhu in a very is a very is very complicated and big. I have only summarized what I consider the essence of Vijnanavada. I can't, more than that, you will all be, you will be bored to death, and I am not going to do that anyway. Now, I will come to the next person, that is Buddhaghosa. One of the greatest philosophers of Theravada Buddhism is, Buddhaghosa. He was a 5th century, commentator and a scholar. You must have, Visuddhi Marga, the path of purification is, his most comprehensive work of the Theravada school of Buddhism. Okay, and in fact, his interpretations are very prestigious and they are quoted again and again and again. He is like Shankara to the Advaita. For the Theravada Buddhists, he was as authoritative as Shankara is to the Advaita philosophy. They say that he was born in India in the 5th century and went to Sri Lanka, Anuradhapura, I think. He went to Anuradhapura, and there he read the Buddhist, the various parts of the Buddhist canon, and he became a Theravada Buddhist. Okay, he is a remarkable philosopher in that. Okay, he overturns many widely held ideas, even the ideas held by us. I will explain only those things, how different Buddhaghosa is. See, whenever we think of our soul, let us say, okay, we think our soul as a chariot, as a sarathi. It directs everything. It holds the reins of all our minds and everything. It it's like a sarathi who controls his horses from chariot's platform. It controls from wherever it is sitting in us. It controls every part of us, every thought of us, in fact. Okay, Buddhaghosa, in fact, he finds this picture of human agency only metaphysical magic. Time and again, he rejects the idea that there is something inside which controls each of our bodily movements or our mental processes that go on within us. In fact, he compares human being to a doll or a mechanical doll or a puppet whose entire being, torso or head or limbs are held together by strings. Okay, he says just like that doll, that puppet is sunya, it is nothing. It is no nirjiva, it is no jivan, it is no, and then it is undirected, without, and it walks or it stands only merely through the combination of strings and wood, whatever it is. Yet it seems as if it had direction and occupation. When a skillful puppeteer, acts on a puppet, it appears amazingly real. So, in the similar way, this body, human body, is also empty, soulless, undirected, and while it walks and stands merely through the combination of the two together, yet it seems it had direction and occupation. How does our body function? This is the question he addresses in a brilliant way. Let me summarize it anyway. Okay, now this chariot thing, it immediately brings to your mind one of the greatest charioteers of India, Lord Krishna. In fact, in Gita, there is a passage which says the same thing. It says, "O Arjuna, the Lord resides in the heart of all beings. His seat is in your heart, making every being revolve through his magical power, as if they were mounted on a machine." Yandra Arudani is a word used in Gita. In fact, the Madhusudana Saraswati explains that the Lord is just like a magician who causes completely non-independent wooden human forms to revolve, seated on a machine and so on, moved by a rope. But this cannot possibly be Buddhaghosa's view that human beings are there's a Namarupa, there's the human body. Human bodies, Buddhist scholars are mechanical things whose movements are controlled from the outside, because Buddhists just don't believe in a divine puppeteer. Okay, so what in introducing this metaphor, Buddhaghosa, simply wants to decry the other metaphor, the charioteer metaphor, which has been flogged beyond death. So what he says is very, very important. If Buddhaghosa had he lived today, he would be tempted to compare humans to those Google self-driven cars. That of course anyone who has gone to Bay Area, you would have seen those cars. Without drivers, it is moving along. Okay, like a self-driving car, according to Buddhaghosa, like a self-driving car, the human being is a complex mechanism in which there are a variety of instruments. Some have the job of detecting what is in the environment. Some monitor the functioning of the mechanism itself. Still others search for objectives or destinations and calculate the best ways of achieving them. But there is no driver in the car directing all these functions. Okay, this is what Buddhaghosa says. You are a puppet, but there is no puppeteer. Okay. Buddhaghosa, develop his alternative metaphor by arguing that all consciousness is already active, that each and every conscious mental state is an expression of that agency. Okay. See, the Buddhists before him, how he turns everything up. So before him, the Buddhists thought of human mind, the flow of the mental life of a human being. They compared it to a rope made of many interwoven, let's say, strands. One could be our sensory, perceptions, that is, or sensory encounters we have, like touch or feel, taste or whatever, smell and things like this. That is one strand. The other strand is, of course, feelings and reactions, love or anger or sadness or whatever it is, and then our reaction to those feelings. The other is, how we are disposed. Are you irritated or whatever habits, that will be another stand. Okay. And there could be another stand of our concepts, what is good and what is bad and things like this. He says our mental life is made of this so many strands. Together they produce a human being, a rope stretched across time. But Buddhaghosa insists that control and activity built into every single moment of conscious experience. Our awareness will build out of many activities which together produce the mindedness, that is our mind that belong to the human being. It's not one strand or few strands. He said there are several such, such experiences. They all become, they weave together and they create the human, whatever the human experience. His point is that every deliberate action, such as, let's say, moving in a certain direction, is a joint product of several capacities working together. Modern science very clearly says it. This is what he says. The Buddhaghosa says this. Okay. Conscious awareness itself is no passive response to the environment, but the activity of mind bending itself onto the world. There is an interplay between mind and body, and between minded body and the worldly environment. Okay. So Buddhaghosa identifies a number of different kinds of activities that make up human experience. Okay. There is awareness which brings us into touch with our environment in a way we are not when we are asleep. Okay. We are able to reach out or direct attention to specific objects, which is what gives thought an object, a goal, or an orientation. So once something comes to our specific attention, we can evaluate it either by judging it as worth pursuing or avoiding, or by classifying it under a certain category. Okay. Buddhaghosa says mind is always attentive, and as we direct ourselves towards certain things and not others. So he says every experience, even mere sitting, is not a matter of passivity. No, it's not. We are not engaging passively at all. This is what he says. It's a very absolutely revolutionary. See, he comes out with some brilliant examples. See, what he says is, let us say you are listening to my lecture now. Okay. Suddenly there is a sound outside. Okay. You hear the sound. So it's loud noise is there outside. Okay. So when you are attending my lecture, you are living the life of the mind, and it's a life full of activity. You are thinking about what I am trying to say. Okay. But the sound outside, which comes you, then afterwards you forget it. Can you say it is passive? Or in the other cases where our mental life seems to be passive, at the mercy of the world outside, a loud noise may force itself upon your attention. Okay, making you look up from or just turn that side and try to find the source of the sound. Okay, it certainly seems as though you involuntarily become aware of noise or direct your attention towards it, thinking what was that noise, But Buddhadeva, what he says is, he denies this. He thinks that the mind already must be actively involved if you are to become aware of the distracting noise. Okay. See, though you are listening to me, your antenna is up for other things also. So it is involved. That's what he says. If it's not involved, you won't be able to hear the sound. Okay. This is what he says. In support of this, he gives three fantastic, analogies. I had to tell you what these analogies. This is in a fantastic book on classical Indian philosophy. I'll tell you that book. You can read. It's a fabulous book. Anyone can read that book. I will mention the book later. When I am going to give a list of books later, so I will mention this book also. Okay. It says three analogies he gives. The first, we are asked to imagine a man asleep under a mango tree who is woken up by the sound of a falling mango. So the man, he is he loves mangoes, so he grabs it and smells it and he finds it heavenly and finally eats it and enjoys it. The second analogy is a king is sitting inside his palace, in his palace, and a villager comes to offer a gift to him. Okay, and he knocks at the palace gate, but the palace guard, let us say, is hard of hearing. So some other some other attendant, he hears that the knock. He orders the attendant to open the gate. The villager comes and gives the king the whatever gift he has. Okay. The third is, of course, the famous example of a spider. An insect falls on a spider's web, and the vibrations, it is felt, so it moves towards to the insect and to suck out his juices. Okay. See, what each of these similes Buddhaghosa says is meant to illustrate that there is quite a lot of mental activity going on backstage, okay, with various functions cooperating to bring something to our attention. Okay, the man, when he hears a sound, okay, he touches it, he smells it, he tastes it, but only because he heard it first. The falling of this thing, he heard it first. So once it there, the other activities also there. So if those functions are they're dormant, he would not be able to smell the apple and taste the apple. Okay, he would not be able to do it. Similarly, the villager could not walk just into the palace because instructions need to be sent to open the gates. Okay, which can only happen only once the king's attendant has heard the knocking and instructed the doors to be open. Okay. In this analogy, the consciousness is compared to the king's receiving and enjoying the gift, and sophisticated mental activity has unfolded in the background of conscious awareness. In the third simile, it looks as if the web is exploited twice. First, to transmit the vibrations from the insect's impact. Okay, vibration spreads right up to the spider, and then again the spider moves towards the insect. What this case suggests is that a single act can do two double duty. First, it gives an alert that there something is present, and second, it reaches out to that place. Okay, so all this helps Buddhaghosa to a major revision of ancient Buddhist theory, even Indian theory. In both Vedic and Buddhist thought, it is frequently held that there are 6 sense faculties, not 5. The sixth is, of course, the mind. The sight, taste, touch, smell, hearing, and the sixth sense. 6 is the mind. Okay, whose job is to perceive cognitive activity that we know. Now, according to the classical philosophy, every faculty has its own domain of special objects. Sight is only tasked to see colors. Okay, and the sixth faculty, the mind, is the one which grasps everything. And then, if you see blue color, mango, it says it not only sees yellow color, it also sees the mango. It combines everything. All faculties it combines, the mind does. But Buddhaghosa, he totally offers a wholesale revision of this theory. He argues that the word mind cannot be reduced to another sense faculty. It is not as simple as the sense of smelling and the sense of seeing. No. He says it refers to a range of different kinds of function associated with sensory perception. Okay, so this is what the first role of mind is, like that of the king's attendant, in the story about the gift from the villager. Okay, mental activity is required to get the senses to orient themselves towards something. As when you turn back from a loud noise to focus on my lecture again, which is analogous to the attendant's command that the palace door to be opened. Such orientation need not be connected only to vision, of course. Or you could notice the sound of a falling mango. When it plays this role, the mind is not a distinct sixth kind of perception, but spans across all five senses, being embedded in their normal functioning. This is very, very important. That's what he says. The same goes for the remaining functions. So Buddha Ghosha assigns to the mind, which are three stages in the sequence of sensory perception. First, there is a basic receiving of a sensory stimulus to the perception, which as it involves no attempts to classify. Okay, it will not describe what is being sensed. The second stage, the thing it classifies. That is, the thing I am seeing is a mango. And there is one further role for the mind to play. Buddha Ghosha's third stage of perception looks, at the mango and it assesses. Okay. So, he said the mind runs across the process perceptions from the various senses, putting them in order so that we can have a unified awareness in consciousness. So, in this, by saying this, Buddha Ghosha's mind is more like a workplace, where activities keep on happening. Nothing is empty, nothing is passive. The mind is full of activity. It is never passive. So that is the inner sixth sense. In fact, the idea is to be totally without being aware of any of these things. That's the final act of nirvana. He says how difficult it is. That's what he wants to convey to us. This is a formidably sophisticated account concerning the working of the mind. If you reflect, each human being is a unique complex of mental and bodily activities with its own internal interactions and characterization. According to Buddha Ghosha, coming to understand this lead to development of empathy, where one conscious creature focuses attentions on another and becomes aware that the other's particular traits and states of mind. So this is, in short, this is what Buddha Ghosha says. Now let me come to my, the third great philosopher. He is, of course, Dignaga. Dignaga is one of the most original thinkers in the whole history of Indian philosophy. He put forward ideas. Good. Thank you, Ganesh. He put forward ideas that transformed. Thank you, Rajendranji. Ideas that transformed Buddhist thought. Philosophers who came after him grappled with these ideas, and the reworking of those ideas achieved by his great follower Dharmakirti. But I am not going to speak about Dharmakirti today. Anyway, what I am going to speak is a combination of the Dignagas. This his idea of Buddhism. In fact, even the opponents of Dignaga subtly changed the system so as to incorporate within them the approaches and distinctions both Dignaga and Dharmakirti introduced. His greatest work is called, Pramana Samuchaya, and there are so many other books anyway. Okay. Dignagas, what is important? I will take only one important contribution. Okay. Common sense tells us that we use perception to grasp ordinary objects in our environment like clouds or elephants or goats or rhinos. Philosophers call this straightforward understanding of perception as direct realism. In Indian, of course, which I have spoken about it earlier, in the Indian tradition, the direct realism was upheld by the Nyaya schools. Dignaga, in fact, argues with great force that immediate objects of perception cannot be external things, not even the fleeting dharmas, recognized by the Abhidharma Buddhism. His argument, goes like this. Suppose we perceive some object out there, that is, the Buddhists, they call it a foundation or a ground or objective support of the perpetual experience. Dignaga says that this supposed foundation would have to be the cause of the experience. For me, to see an elephant, the elephant must cause my visual perception. But this is not clearly enough. Okay. In fact, what Dignaga says, a magician could cause me to have, let's say, David Copperfield. He might conjure up a visual perception of an element. Okay. Then the cause of the perception is actually the magician. But you don't see the magician there. You see the elephant. You don't see the magician, you see the elephant. Okay. In addition, my perception must match up with the thing being perceived. As Dignaga puts it, my experience should have the same form at that thing. Okay. After all, how could I be perceiving an elephant if I think I claim to be perceiving as the shape of a cockroach? Okay. But after having said this, he insists that universals do not exist in nature. Universal means, let me explain. See, when you say cow, when you say a cow, you know what a cow is. When you say a bull, what a cow is. They are all universals. You don't mention a particular cow. When you say cow, okay, it's a universal name to a chewing animal, let us say, a milk-giving animal. Okay. But Dignaga insists that universals do not exist in nature, but only in our minds. They are mere concepts, and everything real is a singular or an individual item. When you reflect, he is right. When you reflect, he is right. There is a cow, but there are cows and cows. Indeed, he takes it to be a straightforward contradiction that one universal could be in multiple instances. Like when you say whiteness in many clouds, he says the whiteness of one cloud cannot be the whiteness of the other cloud. So see, we certainly cannot perceive universals. So as for what we can perceive, you might expect this to be an example for one individual cloud or for one individual white color of a given cloud. But even to say that the very universal concepts that are mere fantasies in the human mind, like white or cloud. So instead, Dignaga claims that objects of perception are inexpressible or ineffable. That is, this cannot be explained. That's what he says. If you say that there's an universal, you are wrong. If you say this is white, you are wrong. If you say this is a white cloud, you are wrong. You are not right. Okay. You cannot explain it. A language cannot explain it. But Language, because that's the only tool we have. You say language is full of reference to universals. Okay. So, if there are no universals, then how does language latch on to the world? He takes up this challenge with with his usual brilliance. Dignaga, before Dignaga, philosophers had given extensive thought to the meaning of words. See, most of our philosophers, give the example of a cow. Okay. See, what cow you perceives depends on the meaning of the sentence. Okay. When you say, look at the cow standing at the end of the street, then when you look at the cow, you perceive a particular cow. It is black. His tail is missing, or his one horn is broken, or whatever it is. His color is black. Whatever it is, you perceive a cow. Okay, or when you say, on the other hand, a cow is an animal. Okay, that cow is not that particular cow. In a language, we are very, very clear about this. This cow is universal. The other cow is, it seems to stand for a generic cow or a class of all particular cows. Dignaga, he has a different idea altogether. What he says in what has come to call as the theory of exclusion, he proposes that words do not need to correspond to anything external. Okay. The word, when you say something, okay, it need not mention the external, correspond to the external, but you will understand, its meaning. It's like an example we can give is, let's say, if someone says, let's say I say that I am an Indian, okay, I need not say that I am an American, or I am a British, or I am a German, okay, I need not keep on. When I say I am an Indian, the person who is hearing me will presume that I am not an American, I am not a German, I am not from Africa. Everything will go. Okay. So the words, it need not correspond to the, but you know that anyway. So the major advantage of this Apoha theory is that it shows how we can do without real universals. When we apply the term cow, we are just discriminating a thing from what is dissimilar to it. In this case, from whatever is not a cow. Okay. So what he says is, universals are, in short, concealed double negations. To say that something is a cow is to say that it is not a non-cow. This is how language works. Okay. Positioning concepts relative to one another. This is what Dignaga says. But you might say that language doesn't always work that way. What about proper names? Krishnan, John, Ibrahim, Lata, or Mary. Here Dignaga answers that we never apply such names to individual objects of perception. That's what he says. Dignaga says, okay. His idea is that we never get a concept so fine-grained that it excludes everything except a single particular. Okay. When you say it's a cow, or when you say it's a black cow, you don't get the entire cow, his tail, his weight, all these things is impossible when you say that thing, No concept can be that fine-grained. So particulars are inexpressible in words and can only be directly perceived. While concepts and words that express them always work at the level of mental construction. This is what he says. So we move internally within that conceptual world when we perceive, when we observe that whatever is a cow is not a giraffe, even though both are animals. Okay. Or that if something is a white cloud, then it is a cloud. Okay. It is these movements that constitute the work of inference and reason. Okay. Dignaga in fact acknowledges only two means of acquiring knowledge, namely perception and inference. He refuses to accept testimony sabda, the assertions of authoritative person as pramana. This is very important. He doesn't even accept. He says it has to be proved. You know, this is not because he thinks testimony never gives us knowledge. Okay, but because when it does so, an inference is required. Okay, so testimony. If you take someone, say for example, in a murder case, the knowledge that one has committed a murder through a series of inferences. Okay, the judge listens to various witnesses, as the judge himself is not a witness to the murder. Okay, so he will proclaim the accused guilty only when he infers that the evidence produced before him by the witnesses is reliable. Okay. In fact, Dignaga uses this example, prosecuting the case against the testimony of Vedic text. Dignaga insists that they can provide no independent source of knowledge. Okay, you just cannot say that it is in Veda, therefore it should be accepted. He doesn't agree to that thing. Okay, in fact, he is the first Indian thinker to distinguish the rules of reasoning, which effectively means determining which arguments are formally valid, from the rules of debate, which have to do with persuading other people of things. Okay, so what you see, this is very, very important. What you say, you may persuade, you may be a very persuasive speaker. Okay, you may persuade thousands and thousands of persons, or like our gurus do, no, thousands of persons. But that doesn't mean that your arguments are intrinsically or formally valid. It is he who clearly makes a distinction. He is the first Indian thinker who made this clear distinction. Okay. Another important thing which Dignaga explains to us is the difference between good and bad inferences. Whether these are involved in inferring to oneself, that is the distinction between reasoning well or badly, or for others, the difference between debating fairly and unfairly. Okay, this also explains very, very beautifully. Okay, for him, any inference can be rendered in a form like the following. This is very, very beautiful. Now, please listen to this. This is absolutely apoha. Yeah, Dignaga, in fact, he says any inference can be rendered into a form like the following. Let us say the famous example everyone says, this mountain has fire because it has smoke. First, a proposition is stated. The mountain has fire. Then a reason is given. Why? How do you know that there's a? Because it has smoke. Okay. Now, there's always an object which is a locus of the inference. There is paksha. What is that? In this example, it is a mountain. Okay. Our inference will seek to show that that mountain, that locus, that basis possesses a property. What is that property? That is, it is having fire. Okay. And how do you establish that it has this property? That is hetu, that is called, this is sadhya, the property is called sadhya, that is. And the third one is hetu. What is the hetu? Meaning of another property possessed by it, that is smoke. Okay. So we establish this by citing a hetu, meaning another property possessed by the locus, that is evidence or reasons for inferring the property we are interested in. So in this case, the property of having smoke. Because it has the one property is there, that is smoke, you immediately relate it to the other property. There is the other property which is fire. So the object, you only see the smoke, you don't see the fire, but you infer that there is fire. From with one property, you infer the other second property which is fire. Thus, for every inference has a form. The locus has an inferred property because it has an evidential property, or that is the paksha is the mountains are the hetu is the smoke, and the sadhya is the fire. Okay. Now there are many inferences which do not have this form, but they are not good inferences. This is very, very important, You should not infer, for instance, you should not infer that the mountain is green because it's, so therefore it's covered with grass. You can infer that, This is one example. But a much better example is given by, in fact, our Manimekalai. Manimekalai gives a beautiful example for this false inference. It says, Annuvayan Chadikkin Munnum, Kadayim Kanigayim, Tamiloru Kalat Toride, Annuvayam Kandan Peragalat, Kade Kandavadate, Kanige Animika Vendamadu Kuda. What he says is very, very simple. Say a person, an idiot, he has seen a Kanige, that is a courtesan, and a donkey at a particular place. Okay. After a week, he sees a donkey in another place. So he is eager. So this donkey is there so that courtesan should also be there. If he says that, he is a fool. This is what Manimekalai says. This is a false inference. This is a false inference. So once you infer something, the inference should be good inference. It should not be bad inference. This Manimekalai, this exactly what Dignaga says. So Manimekalai, in fact, it reflects, many scholars feel that Manimekalai in fact reflects Dignaga's school of Buddhism, This is one example of that, okay. Now I think I can go on and on and on, but it will be very, very complicated. So I think I will stop here, But before we take leave of Buddhism, okay, there's one thing I want to say that, Buddhists, everyone say Atman, no, Atman is not there, Buddhists again this. But in denying the self, Buddhists never meant to deny that we have a mental life. We should not forget that. There are no selves, but there are flowing streams of wonderful, reflexively self-aware moments of consciousness. Such a flowing stream may include memories of past moments and anticipations of future moments. The mistake is to allow ourselves thoughts of the form that I am happy or I am in pain, implying that we can draw a firm boundary around just one stream of objectivity, saying that this and this alone is me. This Buddhism doesn't accept that. Okay. One example is like trying to keep track of individual waves in the sea, thinking that there's a good answer to the question, is there another wave or the same wave as before? Okay. And as a nice example of this sort of question, perhaps would have greeted with silence by the Buddha. This, of course, this example I have taken from this Peter Adamson and Ganere's book, which is a wonderful book. And most of whatever I have stated, many of the things I have stated now is a paraphrase of, or even some of them verbatim of what they have said. I am thankful to them. I am grateful to the author. This is quite a difficult subject. And I had to read a number of times to even understand. I hope I understood to understand what these guys say. They are quite tough. So whatever I understood or misunderstood, I have conveyed to you. So I would request you to go through these books and find for yourself, what they exactly say. I think if I am able to induce a few of you, then I will have achieved my aim. Thank you very much. Good night and have a wonderful night or a day wherever you are. Thank you very much. Bye.